So we suggest the 3 R's, you might say, of centering prayer. Resist no thought, which would be a thought itself, the very resistance. Hang on to no thought, or retain no thought, which is the sign of not getting stuck on any impression or being carried downstream. React emotionally to no thought. The bottom line of those 3 practices is letting go. Trust. And this is the habitual attitude that is being developed as an abiding disposition, as a kind of spiritual poise in our relationship to God. And as it establishes itself, it disidentifies us from our self-image and our worldview and enables us almost spontaneously to start changing them, because our communing with spiritual values begin to replace the more self-centered or material values that we had before. And they just are better, that's all. But they're not yet the best. There's still greater values even than spiritual values. And these are, of course, union and unity with God. But this capacity to let go, renewed daily in the centering prayer practice, enables one, little by little, to let a lot of things go by in daily life that used to drive us up the wall in times past. And it's really the fruit of this prayer that is the only valid criteria. It's a mistake to judge individual experiences as good or bad. First of all, what we call bad experiences, barrage of thoughts, or the experience of fear or raw anger or something that might arise from the unconscious, is a healing process. It's not bad. There's no such thing, if you do the thing, as a poor meditation, because whatever is occurring is part of a dynamic process of which one side is purification and the other is affirmation. And these are constantly alternating through the psychological experience of struggle or desolation, or affirmation and consolation and deep peace. And these 2 movements are gradually establishing in us a relationship with God which transcends both, because we trust that God loves us, whatever our particular experience of the moment is. And as in daily life we begin to see improvement in our relationships with others, and this is the real criteria, then you know that this prayer fits you and is doing you good. We're not talking about some dramatic change, but simply a little bit of change. For instance, if you're accustomed to shouting at the children all day long, now you may be willing to reduce it to just the evening. Or some say if you could improve one human relationship a year in your life, you'd be a saint in about 10 years. Because it's people, really, who challenge all our programs for happiness to see whether we're really selfish or self-giving. Well, anyway, this kind of thought, which is perhaps the most subtle, is when we are in a deep peace and don't want to think or come out of it, so to speak, and are not doing anything except sort of enjoying the presence of the mystery without reflecting on it, then another kind of bait descends into our peaceful space. And this is the tendency to reflect on our state of prayer. And it runs something like this. Oh boy, at last I'm getting someplace. Or this peace is just great. Notice that's a reflection. Now, any reflection on an experience is a photograph of it. It's one step back, and the experience ceases as soon as you start thinking about it. So the immediacy of experience is one of the signs of divine union. You don't have to think about your experiences. if you're really in union with God, because there's nothing to reflect about. You are in union with God, and that union is expressing itself in this moment, in this act. And so in this deep place of prayer, if you can enjoy it without thinking about it, you've learned how to do this method. But something deep inside of us wants to possess the moment of joy, the moment of peace. And this inveterate possessive attitude towards reality inclines us to try to take a piece of it and put it in the icebox for tomorrow, or to save it for a future date. And so we say to ourselves something like this: if only I could remember how I got here. And of course, you don't know how you got there. It just happens. If only I could remember how I got here, so that tomorrow or other meditations, I can do this right away. What wonderful that would be. Notice that's just spiritual greed, that's all. You want to control the spiritual journey. You're trying to manipulate God in this very subtle way. And so God deliberately challenges us with this kind of bait, lovingly teaching us that no possessive attitude, including on the spiritual level, will enable us to transcend the false self-system and reach divine union. You have to let a non-possessive attitude develop. And thus, there's plenty of God, like there's plenty of energy in the universe, plenty of sunshine. It's all ready if you know how to plug into it and to fit your circuits into the right places. It's all there waiting. But we have the noise in the circuitry, and the chief noise is our desire to possess for ourselves. And divine love is the surrender of self. If we can only make that leap, and again, the centering prayer is a discipline to gradually teach us to let go of every possessive attitude, which is quite different from the making use of the good things of this world. The non-possessive attitude is simply the right use of everything, which is to enjoy it while it's present, to let it go when it isn't. And it's this freedom, this detachment, which means to not only to let go of the things that are passing by, but also to accept what's coming. This is detachment also. It's the acceptance of each moment and each thing, each joy as it comes, without trying to hang on to it and make it one's own. Possess it over and against other people in the universe. So it's like the air. There's plenty of it. You can have all you want, but you can't take a chunk of it and put it in your top bureau drawer. So possessiveness is just the wrong kind of response to the spiritual journey and the kind of divine love that we're trying to develop. And so you have to play the game on the level and on the field where it's being played. And if we don't do that, it just isn't going to work. And so this process then is enabling us to disengage ourselves from our old habits and habitual way of responding to likes and dislikes, transcending them in trust and believing in God's love, whatever we receive, and at noticing the fruits in our lives modestly, not expecting to change all at once or to be suddenly transformed, but to willingly engage in the process. All of life is process. Human evolution itself is a kind of, I suppose, a process of becoming divine. And trees take a while to grow. Everything has its cycles, its proper time, its timing. And this is something we have to accept and enter into. And our feverish efforts to possess tend to try to control reality, and when we do, we distort it, and it's no longer genuine reality. One of the great qualities of a little child is its immediacy to reality. Thus, it doesn't It's more interested in the act of seeing than in what it sees. It hasn't developed a judgment as to what is, doesn't develop likes and dislikes really until its second year, more or less. So the child just enjoys doing it, or the process of doing it. And if you ever notice them playing on the floor with blocks, they get totally absorbed whether they build them up or knock them down. It doesn't seem to matter. It's what they're doing that they're enjoying. And maybe this is what makes God happy. He likes to do things. He's always active, but never feverishly. And maybe the activity is himself. We don't know. But certainly when we enter into whatever is as an action, the Word of God is, in the Hebrew text, means event, a happening. It's something that happens in you, to you, around you. And in accepting that word, we're not accepting some abstract idea or articulation of some mystery. We're accepting a dynamic process. And many of the parables teach that the kingdom is this process. It's like a mustard seed that grows. It's like corn that grows whether you notice it or not until the harvest. It's this process of growing and harmonizing and bonding with life that seems to be at the heart of this growing sense of participation in a corporate movement that is growing into ever more deeper penetration and participation in the life of God. One other state of prayer that it might be useful to mention, finally, in this presentation of the kinds of thoughts or impressions or perceptions that come down the stream of consciousness when we quiet our mind. It may happen that at some point in our period of centering prayer, we suddenly realize that for the few moments we haven't been thinking of anything. In other words, there's a kind of gap in our attention. And we know we had no thoughts. We know that we weren't asleep. Although the first few times it may occur to you, well, you think, well, I was asleep, because that's the closest approximation in our past experience to this kind of state. But then it happens a few times, you begin to realize that you really were perfectly alert and awake, and yet were not aware of anything specific, no particular thought, feeling. You were just aware. And this is a kind of a preview of divine union. For a moment or two, your awareness sort of slipped into the ultimate awareness that is present within us, and you kind of touched base, or you had what might be called a kind of spiritual interpenetration or embrace. And this, what happens in those moments, transcends any concept that we have of the divine action. The light of God is so pure, the energy so immense, that there really isn't any faculty to calibrate it or to evaluate it. So St. John of the Cross says that faith is a ray of light. Now, when you compare that with modern quantum physics, it takes on a depth of meaning that is very meaningful indeed. We don't perceive the rays of energy in this room or in this universe, but we know from instruments that have vastly increased our capacity to realize what goes on at other frequencies of sound and sight in this universe. But we do know that there are magnetic fields of energy, there's light as wavelengths, and the universe is just full of all kind of wonderful stuff going on. It's not just space. All kinds of of energies are there. If we could check into them with various instruments, then we readily realize how much is there. So our ordinary senses then, including our psychological states, are only a very limited part of reality. And so the letting go of our limited grasp on reality is a way of allowing our intuitive faculties to enlarge and to begin to perceive, like refined instruments, a greater frequency or a greater perception of what is actually going on. But so far as we know in this life, at least this is John of the Cross's hypothesis, faith, when it is very pure, is totally imperceptible to our consciousness. But it can be going on. That's why the Lord says that the only way to judge a tree is by its fruits. The only way to judge a practice is by its long-range effects in your actual dispositions and behavior. Because the criteria of our psychological apparatus is just too superficial for the profundity, the power, the depth of this work. So when one is totally at rest and not thinking at all for a few moments and experiences this gap, it's somewhat like an anesthesia, you might say. When the doctor wants to rummage in your insides, he puts you totally to sleep. Then when you wake up, you feel great, hopefully. And so by putting all our inquisitive and curious and reactive faculties to rest for a few moments, this sublime physician rearranges a lot of stuff in our spirit that we could never possibly fix, way beyond all forms of therapy. And this is what eventually will begin to appear in our dispositions in daily life, in our emotional swings, which will begin to manifest the ordering that the divine love tends to produce as it's received in greater and greater abundance. It's creative energy, enormous energy, and it's all orientated towards freeing us from our self-centered motivation and introducing us into the creation of the universe, which is coming out of love. So the person who is touching into that energy is bound to begin to become active in the service of others. It's like sitting on a bomb. I mean, you can't sit still. This energy has to be manifested in some form, appropriate to our vocation and state of life. But it's creative in that it does far more than you can possibly imagine when you start out. And this creative energy of divine love, which we are designed to receive as the obstacles to it diminish, is going to work for justice and peace and for the needs of the poor. We don't really hear the cry of the poor. We know they're crying, and we hear it with our ears. But the cry of the poor is really the cry of God in them, asking us to share ourselves in some way. And the intuitions into the interrelatedness of everything in the universe begins to awaken our sense of responsibility. Now, that sense of responsibility grows proportionately with divine love. And as the scripture has suggested, what somebody else's suffering is really our suffering at the deepest level. And so in sharing with others, we are, as the scripture says, healing, clothing, feeding ourselves. Hence, the genuine love of self and respect for our human dignity and our capacities to serve These are qualities that are often diminished or sort of buried under a false sense of guilt, a false sense of human weakness, a false sense of our deficiencies, a sense of low self-worth. All these things are neurotic reactions which have nothing to do with true humility, which acknowledges that everything is coming from God, but that God also is expecting something to come from us now that he's given us all this stuff. And then, do you think that God would bring someone to a state of balance, harmony, and freedom from the false self-system, non-possessive attitude, in order to look at him like a statue? No. Whatever he gives us is for everybody. It's for the whole building up of the universe. And as soon as we start hanging on to it for ourselves in any way at all, we diminish the flow of energy into ourselves. And we begin to cut off and put ourselves into a straitjacket. Divine love is creative, expansive. It is not timid. It is not fearful. As Jesus said in the gospel, fear is useless. And so much of the limitations of our human relations are governed precisely by that attitude on the conscious or unconscious level. This is one of the things that are healed in these deep waters of peace, where our goodness, basic goodness, and capacity for transcendent union with God is reaffirmed and established as a conviction.